Chapter 46. What happens in the common room stays in the common room. Roman 4. Alexander Nutt has lived a good life. A trying life, certainly, but a good one. That wasn't to say that he thought his life was over in any respect. He knew he was getting old, but he didn't intend on stopping. Not when he had Theodore to look after. Alexander had been born into a large family. He had grown up with many aunts and uncles and cousins. He also had a younger brother named Theodore who had sadly died at a young age. He had never made it into Hogwarts, and Alexander could safely say he had never recovered from the loss of his brother. But life moved on, and so did he. He attended Hogwarts, was sorted into Slytherin to no one's surprise, and settled in knowing change was soon on the horizon. It was a talent of the Nutt family, too faint to be considered a bloodline gift, but certainly there, the ability to sense change. When he was younger, Alexander hadn't taken his gifts seriously. He gained a reputation of never losing a bet purely because he could sense before anyone else when something was about to shift. Relationships that sprang up overnight, a teacher handing in their resignation. And so, when everyone else was taunting, mudblood riddle, Alexander did something nobody expected. He abandoned his pureblood friends, his high standing, to go and sit next to poor bastard orphan Tom Riddle. Because he knew maybe ever better than the other boy did himself, that the world would never be the same in the face of Tom Riddle. It was one of the best decisions he'd ever made. He wouldn't say that Tom Riddle saw him as friend, but Alexander thought that he might be the closest the boy would ever let himself have. Confidant, right-hand man, Alexander was there every step of the way. Which was why when one night, after they had graduated Hogwarts and he had woken up in a cold sweat, panting and shivering and shaking, he had been so saddened. He hadn't known what Tom had done to himself, but he knew it was the end. He had thought it was the end of everything, but perhaps it had just been the end of something. He moved on and left Tom. He married the love of his life, and they spent many wonderful years together. He knew he would never meet anyone as wonderful as her in all his years of living, and when she had passed, some part of him left with her. Dragonpox, she was taken from him far too soon. But he still had Thaddeus, his treasured son. Alexander had sworn to protect him, to stand with him, and watch him grow. Alexander had always been able to sense change, and yet he was ashamed to admit he couldn't pinpoint when such a change occurred in his son. Thaddeus had joined the Dark Lord, not Tom. Tom had died a long time ago, and so it seemed had that bright boy Alexander was proud to call a son. But there was still Isabella, a lovely girl, his son's chosen wife. Kind and graceful and happy, Alexander was proud to welcome her into the family with open arms. The day Theodore had been born was one of the happiest days of his life, a precious little grandson. He had suffered greatly in his young life. Alexander had known what a cruel man his own son had grown into, but he had never thought it would extend to even his own family. The night Isabella had been murdered was a trying one, and Theodore had been entrusted into his care ever since. It was hard. Alexander was older than he once was. He couldn't run around after a child like he used to, and it was even harder without his dearest Mary. But he did his best. Theodore was never an outgoing child. It took years for trust to build between them. Alexander provided tutors and books, catered to the whims of the child, and tried his best to make up for the childhood he had lost. He knew Theodore would rather die than admit it, but Alexander knew he still kept his old collection of stuffed dragon toys in the back of his wardrobe. Letting Theodore go to Hogwarts had been hard for him. The manor felt empty without him and his endless curiosity. After a few months of wallowing, Alexander, for the first time in years, returned to politics, recalling what his old friend had said to him all those decades ago. Change is only inevitable if you go out there and make it Alexander. And Alexander had always been good with sensing change, and so it seemed was Theodore. Alexander had had his suspicions before. Theodore had always been too good at chess. But when he came home that Yule speaking of an Eliza Potter, an outcast of Slytherin who Theodore swore would change the world, he knew for certain. What was it that strange muggle author had said? That history did not repeat, but it did often rhyme. Tom had always liked his idioms. Over the next few years, he heard quite a lot about Eliza Potter. Heir Black, Heir Potter, Queen of Slytherin and his grandson's first ever friend. And he knew, just as he has always known, that this girl would bring change like he had witnessed only once before. So when his old friend, Tom Riddle, and it was Tom Riddle, not Voldemort, showed up on his door not looking like he had aged a day since Hogwarts, Alexander knew she had something to do with it, and he couldn't be happier. Tom was back to his old self. Some of his plans were genius, and Alexander hadn't felt such purpose since Theodore had first come to live with him those years ago. To say he was curious about the girl who had made it all happen would be an understatement. "Will you ever learn how to use the flue?" his grandson asked, exasperated. "If I do, you and Draco would owe Blaze 5 galleons," the girl said as she brushed herself off from using the flue, and Alexander couldn't help but laugh. Potter had only been in the manor for less than a minute, and yet he could see how much his grandson cared for her, and vice versa. It was nice to know that his Theodore had found good friends such as these. "I'm afraid I've given your son a few premature heart attacks over the years," she said with a grin as Alexander shook her hand, and he laughed again. Theodore was smiling wryly behind her, not fazed by his friend's behavior. Alexander was just about to reply when he heard his lord's voice cut across the room. "That's because you're a menace, little star," he said liltingly, and Alexander found him watching the pair of them as they conversed. Theodore was standing there as though he was used to the strange interactions which told Alexander that his lord wasn't just being friendly for the sake of it. Narrowing his eyes, he studied the pair of them and was struck suddenly by an old forgotten memory. Alexander snorted quietly, returning to his potions homework as Lucretia Black stalked away in a huff. "I would have thought you would leap at the chance to have prefect rounds with Lucretia. Merlin knows everyone else in our dorm would have," Alexander remarked casually to his lord, for he was his lord. Even then, Alexander prepared himself for a snide remark to be thrown his way, but looked up in confusion when he was only met with silence. Alexander was used to his lord looking pensive. Tom was made up of many sharp edges, quick to anger, and yet protective of what he dubbed his own. It wasn't hard for him to stay out of normal conversation, even if he watched over it all with a sort of detached boredom. Alexander had never seen such a solemn look on his lord before now, not even in first year when he was simply Mudblood Riddle. "I don't see why I should waste my time with her," his lord commented idly, still oddly subdued. Alexander placed down his quill and turned his full attention onto Tom. "I thought you two had a thing," he asked. It was a dangerous business, talking feelings to Tom. Salazar, the last time Avery had even dared to, albeit crudely, ask about Tom and Lucretia, the boy had been too traumatized to speak for days. But Alexander knew Tom liked him a bit more than Avery, not that that was a hard thing to achieve. An odd melancholy fell over Tom, and Alexander felt like he was intruding on something rather private as he watched the other boy heave a sigh. "Did I ever tell you about my mother?" he questioned slowly, his eyes far away as if Tom wasn't aware he was talking. Alexander shook his head in response. "Of course, we all know I'm a descendant of Slytherin on my mother's side. She died before I was born and left me in that dirty Muggle orphanage." Tom hated talking about the orphanage. Alexander almost dropped his jaw, his surprise. "The reason I never had a father was because dear mother dosed him with love potions. No wonder he left as soon as he got a chance." Tom scoffed bitterly, and Alexander hurriedly connected the dots in his mind. "But children, as research dictates, children born under the influence of a Mortentia cannot feel love." Tom cut in smoothly, and his voice was so empty Alexander felt his heart ache. "So no," Tom said briskly, reaching over the coffee table to grab his textbook, "I don't have a thing with Lucretia. I doubt I will have that with anyone. I promised Sirius I would be back for tea," Eliza was saying as Tom led her away, and Alexander was sure neither of them had noticed Tom's hand resting against the small of her back. "Well, tell him you can't make it," his lord said unworried. "He won't be happy. If you continue to complain, neither will I," his lord remarked, but unlike his usual snappy tone of voice, his words held an undercurrent of fondness. "Are they always like that?" Alexander asked Theodore as the pair let the door swing shut behind them. Theodore grimaced and let out a long-suffering sigh. "Constantly." Alexander laughed harder than he had in years. "Children born under the influence of a Mortentia cannot feel love." Alexander wouldn't be too sure about that. Sirius took another gulp of fire whiskey. He had stopped pouring himself glasses some 3 bottles ago and had now just started drinking it straight from the bottle. He felt the tears streaming down his face, but he made no move to brush them away. There was no one around to witness his mental breakdown anyway. Eliza was staying over at Nart Manor having a sleepover with her court, and Remus had returned to his family home for the night of the full moon. Sirius had offered to go with him, but Remus had turned him down, obviously noticing the deep bags under his eyes and the tremors in his hands. Azkaban would forever leave its marks on his person, so it seemed. Sirius let out another ugly sob as he clung to his bottle like it was his savior. It would have been Regulus' birthday today, if he had lived that long. He had died at 17. Merlin Eliza was almost 17, and she was still just a kid. Regulus had just been a kid, and he had sacrificed himself, had died rather than reach out to his brother, because Sirius had been dumb and rash and immature and reckless. And he had lost Regulus and Lily and James, had condemned Eliza to all those years at the orphanage and the Dursleys when he was left to rot in Azkaban. 12 years of mouldy food, concrete floors, and not a spark of happiness. Maybe he deserved it. Maybe he still did. He wondered what James would think of him if he knew what side of the war Sirius fought on now. They had both become disillusioned with Dumbledore's rhetoric in the end. They had killed just as many Death Eaters as they had killed Order members. Just because they had been able to wash the blood of their hands didn't make them holy, didn't make them righteous. And Eliza. Merlin, he tried to do his best, but he had no idea what he was doing. Family meals and Sabbaths, day trips out as a family, as he tried to make up for all those years he had lost. He just wanted her safe and happy, but even Sirius himself couldn't think of what that looked like. Even those years as the marauders at Hogwarts had always been coated with an underlying threat. Whether it be his family or the growing war, Sirius couldn't say his childhood had been safe and happy either. He wished it had been. He wished for a lot of things. Another ragged sob left his throat. He was too wrapped up in his sorrow to notice the flu flaring in the living room. In fact, he didn't notice Narcissa until she crouched down beside him, somehow keeping her balance even in her heels. "Oh, Sirius," she breathed softly, a small frown on her face as she came to sit next to him. Confused and still unsure whether he was actually hallucinating her or not, Sirius offered her a bit of fire whiskey. Narcissa let out a soft, watery laugh and pushed the bottle away. "I'm afraid I drink things with a bit more class, sweetie," she joked, and Sirius knew that this was definitely the real Narcissa. Hallucination Narcissa had never come up with such deplorable pet names. What are you doing here?" Sirius slurred out, frowning when Narcissa took the bottle from his hands. "Eliza worries about leaving you alone. She ordered Creature to come and get me if he thought you weren't doing too well." Sirius tried to laugh, but instead it came out as more of a sob. "She's such a good kid." "She is," Narcissa agreed easily, and Sirius noticed how out of place she looked sitting down cross-legged on the floor of his living room in her pristine clothes. Regulus was just a kid, Sirius found himself saying, and he felt Narcissa tense up beside him. "And I let him down. And I let James down, and Lily down, and now they're all dead." And Sirius angrily wiped the tears from his face, and smiled slightly when Narcissa took his hand in her own. "We were just kids, Sirius. Kids in a war too big for us that we had no business fighting in," Narcissa said, and Sirius wondered how many times she had told herself those exact words. "We were never just kids, Sissa," Sirius said. "Not us." Sissa took a swig of the bottle and Sirius laughed when she cringed at the taste. "I certainly feel like a child now, drinking cheap booze with my kid cousin," she said, and Sirius let out an affronted gasp. "You love me, really," he said with a pout and grinned when Sissa flung her arm over his shoulder. "Of course I do, your family, and there's nothing more important than that." They stayed like that till morning, reminiscing about the past. Eliza found them slumped over each other the next day. "Rough night," she chirped with a crooked grin, and both Sirius and Narcissa let out groans at her loud voice. Eliza laughed brightly and headed to the kitchen, coming back with 2 hangover cures. "Love you, pup," Sirius shouted up the stairs as Eliza left them to it, and smiled when he heard her quiet laughter. Nothing more important than family indeed. Tom had better things to do than break into own offshore Gringotts accounts. He could be organizing raids, or killing muggles, or even be drinking Lucius, expensive wine, in frant of the fire with Nagini. Instead, he was in freezing cold Russia, trying to gain access to his old accounts for a Morgana-damned birthday present. Eliza being a necromancer had been a shock, and Tom honestly wasn't that surprised that she couldn't find any books on the subject matter in England. Tom had travelled far and wide to gain as much knowledge as he had thanks to Britain's ridiculous views on magic. But he wouldn't think about that now. Thinking about backwater, Britain made him annoyed, and when he got annoyed, he always felt vaguely murderous. Murdering the accountant in front of him would be counterproductive to getting into his vault. 11 years as an incorporeal wraith had taught him patience, but not this much patience. But it would be worth it, Tom thought with a sigh of relief as he was finally let into his account. His precious Horcrux only deserved the finest things in life, and Tom would make sure she did. Wandering around his old cache, Tom smirked as he found one of the few necromancy books he had ever managed to acquire. The damned thing had never opened him, the leather cover, which he suspected was actually human skin, but he wouldn't mention that, always remained firmly bound whenever he so much as ran a hand over its spine. He could only hope Eliza would have better luck with it. Just as he was about to leave, he noticed a shelf full of rare metal and stones from his travel, including a large hunk of bloodstone. Of course, healing crystals were seen as a Wicca magic these days more often than not. Not many people believed in the mystical energy stones carried, but they couldn't negate the fact that certain stones and metals were far more suited to other forms of magic. Bloodstone had a close connection to blood magic, rather obviously, but it also did well as a binding agent between family magics. It focuses on the ties that bind. Tom pocketed the chunk of stone on his way out. He had seen some of the things Eliza had made over the years. He was sure he could try a hand at it himself. It was worth it all in the end. Eliza looked stunning when she opened the door, and Tom couldn't help but wonder how he had been blind to his Horcrux's beauty for so long. Even dressed in disastrous Muggle clothing, some strange, short-knitted sweater and ripped jeans, she looked like a picture. "What are you doing here?" she asked, crossing her arms and raising an eyebrow as Tom grinned at her. He always found himself smiling around her. Something about Eliza Potter made his soul, fractured and shattered as it was, feel giddy. "Well, it is your birthday," he replied, echoing the words she had told him last year when she dragged him out for a surprise picnic. Tom handed the bag of presents towards her, as well as the bouquet, and took a step back. He blinked in surprise when she asked him to come in. He could hear the rest of her family chattering inside, happy and carefree. He knew the second he entered the room the tension would be stifling, and as much as he wanted to see her face when she saw his gift desk, he wouldn't ruin this day for her. He had stopped asking himself why he cared so much about Eliza's emotional welfare a long time ago. He had never been one to ignore his problems, but Eliza Potter was just one problem he couldn't bring himself to face. He smiled slightly as she peered into the bag, a look of undisguised curiosity lighting up her emerald eyes before he silently apparated away. It had been worth it. She was worth it all. Eliza was acting strange. Theo knew it. Blaze knew it. Everyone knew it. Of course, Theo wouldn't say Eliza was the definition of normality. She was far from it, and even he could admit Eliza was unpredictable at the best of times. But he knew his best friend. She was restless and easy to irritate, protective, and full of mischief and sadism in equal measure. But he honestly couldn't recall seeing her like this ever before, except maybe third year. She was still restless, but in a completely different way. Eliza didn't like sitting still, but Theo knew she preferred looking poised. Instead, every day at dinner this week, her leg hadn't stopped bouncing. When they all met in the common room, she was already awake, pacing the floors. She disappeared for hours at a time, only to be despondent in class, and sometimes when she thought no one was looking, she'd get this strange look in her eyes, as if she was looking for something that wasn't there. Theo honestly wasn't that surprised when she decided to cause some havoc in Umbridge's class, but he was surprised at the change he felt much later. He wouldn't say he had a bloodline gift, and he certainly wasn't a seer. But sometimes, just sometimes he blinked, and suddenly he knew. There's a sort of pull, a tug at his mind that told him this is important. He had first felt it that night he had lost his mother. He felt it again when he met Eliza Potter, and he felt it now, lightly at the back of his mind. A sort of knowledge that he had somewhere else to be. So when they returned to the common room to find Professor Snape pacing the floors, talking about how he and Eliza had had a row, and now she had dropped off the edge of the earth, Theo wasn't that surprised. Instead, he headed down to the Chamber of Secrets, knowing that his best friend was there, and that right now, she needed nothing more than a shoulder to cry on. And Theo had shoulders that were happy to provide. Theo paused when he found Eliza curled up under a blanket in one of the armchairs of the office. Theo was used to seeing Eliza standing proud, loud and bright and full of energy. Even at her most violent, she had never looked so empty. He wasn't used to seeing her so small, so tired. He joined her under the threadbare blanket and vowed to cheer her up however he could. Theo couldn't even count how many times Eliza had been there for him. It was time for him to return to the favor. "Hey, Theo," Eliza said sometime afterwards, sipping from her giant mug of hot chocolate. "Thank you." He didn't know why Eliza could never say those words, but it was okay. Theo knew what she meant anyway. He smiled slightly and hugged her closer. "Love you too." In general, most people had no idea what Eliza Potter was really like. It all depended on which rumors you chose to listen to. Eliza Potter was violent. She was trouble and the next Dark Lady. She put up a good front, but that was all it was, a front. Susan found it was mostly the Gryffindors who believed all of that, and the Ravenclaws, at least the ones who cared about gossip that was. Most Hufflepuffs believed otherwise. Eliza, although perhaps not altruistic, that was Slytherins for you, could be kind. She was helpful and protective of her friends, and she was wicked smart. Distant at times, but she tried her best. Susan knew that all of that was true at once. She had been with Daphne for the better part of a year now, and there was no way you could get close to one of Eliza's friends without being dragged into her life, just a bit. Although they didn't call themselves friends, it was a Slytherin thing apparently, the court. Susan was just glad to be a Hufflepuff. She was invested in politics, but Merlin she was happy to have a break from it. She knew that Eliza was protective, as well as violent. She was kind to those she loved, and put up a good pretense when it served, although it usually wasn't done out of any maliciousness. Of course, Susan knew she didn't know everything. She didn't expect to know everything. Daphne was wonderful and gorgeous and funny, but she was also a greengrass, just like how Susan was a bones. Family business came before anything else. It always would. And she knew Daphne considered Eliza family. It wasn't her place to nosy into their private family business. Honestly, she was just happy that Eliza considered her good enough to date one of her friends. The last time a girl had tried to dose Blaze, Zabini, with a mild love potion, she had ended up in the hospital wing for a week. Sleep paralysis curse. Nasty business. Susan was happy to say that she hadn't ever been put under a sleep paralysis curse. It was the small victories that counted. Susan didn't think even Eliza Potter could keep her and Daphne apart, though. "Hey, Susan," Daphne said with a grin, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder when she came to meet Susan after her divination class. "Care to join me on my prefect rounds tonight?" Daphne really was something else. Tom felt rage course through him. He was used to being angry, of course. He was always angry. Angry at the state of the world, angry at the hand he had been dealt, angry at Dumbledore and his saccharine bullshit. He was familiar with fury, he knew it well. This was different. Can you believe she used a fucking blood quill on me? So much for our loving and light ministry, a blood quill. Someone had dared to use a blood quill on his little star. They had hurt her and marked her, and there was nothing Tom could do, so far away from his Horcrux. Eliza was supposed to be safe in Hogwarts, protected under the wards, and instead someone had hurt her. Tom wanted to find Umbridge. He wanted to find her and rip her to shreds. No quick death, no mercy. He would use a blood quill on her instead. No, actually, scratch that. He'd use a normal quill. It would be a slow process, very slow, but he'd carve words into every inch of his skin himself. Maybe he would have her do it. The Imperious Curse could do wonders. He would have her mutilate herself for hours. There would be no relief. But Eliza had different plans that didn't involve any torture or murder, and Tom would never get in the way of someone else's retribution. "I still think you should kill her," he wrote anyway. He doubted Eliza would need that much convincing anyway once Umbridge dared to lay even a pinky finger on one of her court. And Eliza was more violent than he was. Well, perhaps not more violent, but certainly more creative. Tom could admit he wasn't completely sane. He was fully aware of that fact, and it didn't bother him in the slightest. But he preferred the deaths he dealt to be clean. Not painless, almost never painless, but usually always clean. He knew Eliza liked to be a bit more involved. He didn't know whether it was because she hadn't been out of the Muggle world that long or something else entirely, but most of Eliza's work tended to be a bit gory. Blood and guts and violent deaths followed her when she fought. She really was rather brilliant. The second I'm home for Yule, we can drag her name through the mud. Yule, there were still a few months until Yule. Tom had never longed for companionship before. Most people he simply tolerated, and it always felt like there was a space between him and them. Some indefinable gap. Some said it was arrogance, but Tom didn't believe it. He had seen arrogance, had seen how the high horse people sat themselves on caused divides. But he simply felt different from the rest. There was just something not quite there about him that seemingly everyone could sense. Eliza didn't seem to be bothered with any of that, and he found himself missing her company. Missing that feeling he got when he was close to her, happiness and warmth, that undeniable feeling that he had once again found something he had lost a long time ago. Yule is still quite far away. Yeah, it is. Tom didn't reply to her message, but it was nice to know he wasn't the only one missing the other's company. For the longest time, Draco had been insecure over being heir Malfoy. It was a big legacy to hold after all, especially considering he was related to the Blackass as well. Malfoys had a lot of sway in the wizarding community, rich and powerful wizards since the Roman times. And although his father had probably never meant to make him feel such a way, Draco couldn't deny that he had always feared disappointing his family, his father, and letting down the family name. Any thought that could have classified him as a blood traitor was kept locked in the back of his mind. He would be the perfect son and carry the Malfoy name with pride. But Hogwarts changed that. Because Eliza Potter showed him that perhaps being a good son didn't necessarily equate to being a good Malfoy. Because Eliza Potter was a half-blood, and she was the most powerful person he had ever met. Blood status didn't equate to power, and it turned out his father had been raising him to be a good Death Eater and not a good Malfoy. Once he realized that, things got a bit easier. He had a heart-to-heart with his father. He grew up a bit, and he found another family with Eliza, with Blaise, Theo, and Daphne, and he swore he'd continue the legacy of the Malfoy line. But he had always suffered from that niggling bit of doubt that perhaps he really wasn't good enough. Tonight changed that. It was the first Samhain he had been able to celebrate properly since, well, ever. He had been too young to remember any rituals he had taken part in before, and as something unfortunate seemed to happen every Samhain since, he was adamantly not thinking about the betting pool they had on. This was the first year they had attempted it. Draco allowed Eliza's voice to wash over him, felt the magic in the chamber swell as the candle flared in front of him. And then he was gone, fallen into a trance. He thought he could feel the wind on his face. It reminded him of his grandfather. Abraxas Malfoy had always loved flying. He used to watch Draco all the time. He felt warmth, happiness, the knowledge that he was a part of something greater than himself, but above all that he felt pride. Warm, loud, unabashed pride of his ancestors. When he came back, the chamber was almost empty, and his face was suspiciously wet. The flame of his candle had now spluttered out, leaving melted wax in its place. And now there was no place for doubt. He was a good friend and a good son. And more than anything, he was a good Malfoy. He couldn't ask for more. "Are you okay?" Eliza asked sometime later. The others had gone to bed a while ago, but Draco had stayed awake, watching the crackling flames in the fireplace as he burrowed further into his blanket. "Yeah," he said with a sleepy smile. "Just family," he said with a sigh. "It really is something, isn't it?" Eliza smiled at him, soft and kind, and everything he knew she didn't think she was, and grabbed his hand beneath the blankets. "Yeah, it is." Tom smiled as he listened to Eliza rattling off plan after plan across from him. She really was intelligent, a cunning mind and sharp green eyes that burned, lighting up as she continued to lay out her plan for him. "You have the whole of magical Britain, just waiting for you to take it," she said, eyes bright, and Tom couldn't bring himself to look away. He didn't think he could look away even if he tried. He was reminded of her memories, the memories she had given to him. "You have the whole world out there, just waiting for you to take it." "To victory, little star," Tom said, pouring her a butterbeer which he only kept in his office anyway for when she came round. "To victory," she repeated, a blush dusting her cheeks. Tom still wanted the world, but he wouldn't mind having something else now either. The Malfoy Yule Ball was always a pain to attend. Useful, certainly. Tom couldn't deny that he had made many connections over the years at Malfoy's many Yule Balls, but that never negated the fact that they were dreadfully droll. You charm one bored, unhappily married noblewoman, and you've charmed them all. You pretend to find one poorly aging portly politician funny, and you've met the whole ministry. And he couldn't even murder anybody to alleviate said boredom. Lucius was a dedicated follower, but Tom doubted even he would be okay if Tom decided to go and murder the next person who thought he would actually consider dancing with him. They were all so boring. Well, almost all of them. "How can you be my Prince Charming if you've yet to ask me to dance?" she asked, and Tom felt his lips curl into a smile. He had debated murdering the next person who asked him that, but for Eliza he found he really didn't mind. She had that smile on her face, crooked and teasing and smug. Tom placed his hand in hers. It was odd how seamlessly they fit together. They found each other easily, and Tom rested his hand on her waist as they swayed to the music. She really was a sight. The dark blue dress glimmered with diamonds, and he felt a flash of satisfaction when he saw she was wearing his necklace. Her long hair cascaded down her back, and Tom had to resist the urge to run his fingers through it. He had always had a taste for pretty things. He let her go, a wicked glint in her eyes and a smirk on her lips as she went off to cause some chaos. She seemed to blend into the crowd. Tom watched her easily slip into conversations and disappear without a trace. He found her in the garden some time later, eyes locked on the stars that she loved so much as she sipped on her wine. He watched amused when she wrinkled her nose slightly, glaring cross-eyed, the lump of snow that had landed on it. She hated snow. He came to stand beside her, stealing her glass deftly and taking a sip for himself. It was snowing. He should be cold. Tom was always cold. But instead he felt a curious warmth that only grew stronger the more time he spent with her. "I have my secret classroom now," she was explaining, waving her hand distractedly, oblivious to the snow that was landing in her hair as she spoke. "Well, you are a rather brilliant teacher," he freely admitted. He had no problem recognizing talent when he saw it. After all, it would have to take a rather remarkable person to teach him of all people the Patronus charm. "And how would you know?" she questioned, a challenging edge to her words, and Tom found himself pausing. He had no need to prove himself to her, no obligation. He didn't have to show he anything. Idly, Tom wondered when need had passed into want. Because he did, he wanted to show her. Just as she surprised him time and time again over the years with every show of strength and vulnerability, Tom wanted to return the favor. "The Patronus is a complex thing," he murmured, and he felt Eliza freeze next to him, a true portrayal of our soul. Before Eliza had spoken to him, Tom hadn't tried to cast the Patronus charm since he studied his newts. No, actually, he had gotten rather dunk on his birthday one year when he was in New Orleans and had attempted it again, and had gotten no more than a wisp. After receiving Eliza's instructions, he had tried it once again in the chamber. He didn't know why he thought that time it would be any different. But out souls do not begin with just happiness, and they do not end with only love, he recited verbatim. "You thought I could do it, if I really tried," because he had lied to himself back then. He had thought he didn't know what was different, but the truth was he did. Because Eliza Potter had told him she believed, and for some ineffable damnable reason that was enough. He thought about what he was fighting for, everything he wanted. He wanted to save Magic Britain, to be more than what he came from. He wanted the world to remember his name, and he wanted to fix his mistakes. He wanted to be remembered for doing great things, not just terrible ones. "Expecto Patronum," he whispered and watched as his dragon flew around the courtyard. Eliza gasped sharply next to him, eyes bright and wide, lips parted as she tracked the dragon around the garden. Her face covered in amazement, awed, and when she turned to him with that blinding smile, Tom recognized, somewhat detachedly, that he was done for. He leaned in further. All his life he had never been one to turn away from hedonism. He was a decadent to the highest degree, and had never shied away from temptation. And Eliza Potter was by far the most tempting fucking thing he had ever indulged in. He heard her breath hitch, and felt himself smirk before Eliza. Draco was lucky Tom was fond of the Malfoys. He had never been closer to murdering one of his followers before. He watched Eliza as she dashed away, Cinderella leaving the ball, and turned back to observe the stars in the night sky. And if he had thought of something else when he cast his patroness, of a girl with bright eyes and brilliant smile, then well, no one had to know that but him. Tom took great pleasure in dueling the auras inside Azkaban. Although perhaps dueling was too loose a term, considering the auras didn't even put up a fight. Tom usually preferred quick and clean death, but he decided to take a page out of Eliza's book to alleviate his growing boredom. He didn't regret returning to his original plans, abandoning his crazy warfare tactics, but that didn't mean he didn't miss the violence of it all. Having his Horcruxes back returned him to his former state of sanity, but that didn't mean he was necessarily completely sane. But that was fine. Anyone who knew him knew that already, and anyone who didn't like it would be dead. It was a tried and tested system. One only had to look at the dead aura on the floor to know that. His Death Eaters were in a bad shape as he shepherded them through the halls. Not that he had really expected otherwise, but when he became their lord he swore to protect them. They were his, and he couldn't just leave what was his own to rot away in a cell. He met up with Eliza quickly, sensing her discomfort. Tom couldn't really feel the Dementor's effects that much. He grew colder, but it was tolerable. He knew Eliza despised them, however, and he made a point to exit the crumbling building as quick as possible. Even with her golden gilded mask covering her face, Tom could still read her. And he also knew that as much as she hated Azkaban, she was looking forward to the battle with the Order as much as he was. It was a shame he had to focus on his own targets. It was always a pleasure to watch Eliza in action. He took 2 Order members out in front of him in one spell. He wouldn't wait complex magic on these witless morons. Even in death, they wouldn't be worth the energy. Slicing their throats clean through Tom easily deflected the curses the others sent towards him. He entertained the last 3 for a bit, baiting them before he grew bored. He dropped one with a simple Avada Kedavra and hit the second with a nasty bludgeoning curse. He watched in amusement as the man's skull caved in on itself, and he dropped to the ground with a heavy thump. The last Order member looked like some poor Aura trainee, barely out of Hogwarts, and Tom grinned viciously as he approached close and closer until the man had backed up to the sea line and rocky cliffs. He disarmed the man laughably easy and wrapped a hand around his throat, feeling the pulse hammer wildly beneath his fingers. "And where's your hero now?" He couldn't help but taunt as he waited for the last remaining Order member to sneak up behind him. With a loud crack, Tom snapped the man's neck and dropped him, whirling around to take care of the last one, only to find that Eliza had gotten there first. There was a moment of silence, a strange peace in the aftermath before the next troop of auras arrived. Tom didn't even give them a chance and focused himself, casting Fiendfire to stop the next lot of aura forces even making it to the island. He watched Eliza as she basked in the flow of the roaring flames, the burning orange fire clashing with her arsenic green eyes, bodies littered about her feet. She was dangerous. There was no doubt in his mind about that, but Tom has always enjoyed a bit of danger. "Shall I drop you off home then, darling?" He asked pleasantly and watched when she span around to face him, black hair shifting wildly with the movement, and she looked just like a girl again. A girl, and yet so much more. There was nothing Severus wanted more in this moment than a coffee. A black coffee, a blueberry muffin, and perhaps a simple life. But Severus couldn't have any of that, because he had made some truly terrible life choices and ended up as a spy, turned double spy, turned whatever number of traitorous backstabbing he had done now. He knew he was never going to get his simple life, but the least he could get was a fucking coffee. And he was the man Dumbledore entrusted with career's advice. Severus sighed once again as the Order continued to shriek and shout around him. He should really be paying attention so he could report back to his lord, but perhaps even the Dark Lord would understand it was just so much easier to ignore the Order's incompetency than to listen to it. "But have you seen the paper?" Marley shrieked. "Merlin, he wanted a coffee so bad. I can't believe they're making it out that we were the bad guys." Tonks whined. "We wouldn't have been there if the minister would just bloody believe us. Fudge won't say anything that will make his life harder." "It's much easier to ignore the problem than face it," Shacklebolt commented, "although I don't know how they can ignore 16 escaped Death Eaters. A whole new round of arguing set off. "You've been rather quiet, Snape," Moody growled out. "Didn't you get told about this?" Out of everyone in the Order, Severus was looking forward to Moody's death the most. The old Auror was too paranoid for his own good, everyone thought it, but Severus was the only one who knew he spoke the truth. "It's a Death Eater, always a Death Eater." "No, he didn't," Severus replied tiredly. "I thought he trusted you," Moody accused, and Severus let out a long drawn-out sigh. "Of course he doesn't. He employs me to be a spy," Black snorted in the corner. He and Remus had remained quiet throughout the meeting, but he would never pass up on a chance to piss off Severus. Of course, he would get involved now. However, before Severus could open his mouth, Tonks interrupted. "What about that woman who was with him?" "Eris, Eliza fucking Potter. Would it kill them to stop with the dramatics for just one night?" "That is indeed worrying news." Dumbledore spoke somberly. "Hestia managed to escape with her life. This Eris is a proficient dueler and seems to have replaced Bellatrix Lestrange in her absence. We have next to no knowledge of this person other than that they may have a Muggle background judging by the moniker. But that is neither here nor there. What's our next move?" Shacklebolt asked. Severus knew what his next move was. He was going to go home and pour himself a black coffee and contemplate just why he continued to involve himself in mess after mess. "Serious," Dumbledore said, and everyone turned to Black, who Severus was sure had been playing footsie under the table with Remus. "Am I right to assume Eliza is still in close contact with a certain Thomas Gaunt?" "Oh no." Black shuffled slightly before nodding. "She's been visiting him over the holidays," he admitted, and Molly let out a scoff across the table. "That Gaunt boy is nothing but trouble. Someone needs to warn that girl about what kind of man he is." Severus kept his eyes on Black, who tensed at the mention of Eliza. Severus knew he would. That man considered her a daughter, and no Black would ever stand for slander against their family. "Eliza can handle herself," Black said easily with a grin, and Molly let out a huff. "Poor girl shouldn't have to. She should have had someone looking out for her, stop her going down the wrong path." "And what do you mean by that, Molly?" Black asked lightly, with a small, polite smile. Severus hadn't known Black could resemble anything close to polite. "Well, it's not like you've been around to teach her these things, is it?" Molly commented snidely. Black's eyes flashed dangerously. "Excuse you." Severus snapped his attention towards Remus. He was sat at the table looking murderous as he glared at Molly across the table. Sirius was in Azkaban for a decade, not some bloody vacation home for ex-convicts. "It doesn't change the fact," Molly was saying, but she was cut off when Remus's eyes flashed a warning shade of amber, and Severus felt himself tense. "Sirius loves the bones of that girl, and so do I. She's practically a daughter to us, and you have no right." "I'm only looking out for the girl," Severus questioned, why he was even bothering before he determined. He really had spent too much time with his idiotic Slytherin students when he interrupted. "With all due respect, Marley, all due respect being none. Anyone can see that Eliza is perfectly fine and happy with Sirius and Remus, and as much as it pains me to admit it, they are clearly the best thing for the girl. She finally has a family, and to imply that they're not doing the best for her is insulting at best and blood feud worthy at worst." Severus drawled, and felt his lips twitch slightly at the sight of Black's gobsmacked face. Silence descended over the meeting. No one ever thought they'd see the day where Severus would defend Black and a Potter. Severus gestured for Dumbledore to continue and ignored the knowing, proud smile Minerva sent his way. He hoped Minerva would accept the Dark Lord's inevitable reign. She really was a powerful witch. "Well said, Severus," Dumbledore commented with that infernal twinkle in his eye. "Now, as I was saying, our next order of business is to begin tracking one Thomas Gaunt and see where he was the night of the attack." Oh shit. Severus was never going to get that coffee, was he? Tom sighed as he leant against the side of the building, eyeing the muggles around him in vague distaste before his sight landed on a man smoking a cigarette. He used to smoke in his teens, anything to get through war times, but he had long since shaken the habit. That didn't mean he didn't occasionally hunger for a smoke, however. His Death Eaters were back at his manor, together celebrating the new year. They had all taken to his change in direction remarkably well. He couldn't decide if it was because their minds were too damaged to truly comprehend his plans, or if he had underestimated the fervor in which they wished to serve him. Even Bellatrix had accepted their new plan of attack if he set aside the small duel she had with his little star. Not that it hadn't been entertaining to watch. He had planned to spend the night alone with Nagini until Eliza had once again barged into his life, telling him to meet her in Muggle London, a few streets off the Royal Albert. Tom used to people watch near here when he was just a kid. Theatres meant people with money, and people with money were usually easy pickings. Plus sometimes they left the stage door open. Tom had only ever managed to slip inside once when he was 12, but he had never forgotten what it had been like. Tom snapped to attention when he felt that curious warmth once again flood his system, a sure sign that Eliza was somewhere near, and when he spotted her in the crowd, he actually felt his breathing hitch. The dress she was wearing was short, scandalously so, exposing her long legs as she walked towards him. It hugged her figure, and Tom had to exercise his self-control as she neared him. Tom had met a lot of people in all his years of living. None could compare to her. "Do I finally get to find out where exactly we're going tonight?" Tom asked, and watched as she smiled mischievously before fishing 2 tickets out of her purse. 2 tickets for his favorite opera at the Royal Albert Theatre. He let her drag him in through the theatre doors, to the top box seats, and as Tom looked around in barely concealed wonder, he questioned just what he had done to deserve having someone like Eliza give a damn about someone like him. The wine was lovely, the music was amazing, and throughout it all Eliza's hand remained clasped in his own. When he sat down at the piano, he played for himself, a celebration of how far he had come and how much farther he was going to go. But he also found himself playing for her. It was a strange feeling to know that your entire life had changed just because of one person. For so long Tom had been alone, and he had been fine with alone. He had been fine with just himself against the world, but for the first time in, well, forever, Eliza made him want to change that. For how could being alone compare to having Eliza by his side? "What are you thinking about, little star?" he asked lowly, stood on the doorstep of her house as she stared up at him. "I'm thinking about how much I would like to kiss you right now. There are some eyes that can devour you." Tom knows that to be true as he stared into Eliza's. Bright and unyielding, and practically begging for him to close the distance between them. "Really, Eliza? Then what's stopping you?" Tom has kissed people before, but not often. He was no stranger to one-night stand. But kissing had always felt far too intimate an action. Monsters were not made for kissing. They were not made for love. Eliza's lips met his, and he forgot everything that had ever held him back. Gentle but demanding, Tom's mind emptied, and the only thing he could focus on was Eliza. Tangling his hand in her hair, he pulled her closer against him because he wanted her closer to him, needed her closer to him. He pulled away far too soon. He felt like he could kiss Eliza for an eternity and never tire of it, because he could never tire of her. Big Ben struck midnight. Fireworks lit up the sky above them, and he left her on the doorstep of her house with a quiet, happy New Year. And she left him with the phantom feeling of her lips pressing against his, a memory he was sure he would never be able to forget. Tom used to smoke. He was no stranger to addiction, and Eliza Potter had just become his newest fixation. Blaze stared down at the letter his family owl, Brutus, had delivered that morning. Blaze didn't often get mail. His mother was far too busy to care about the son he was sure she only had out of obligation. So when he did get mail, especially mail of his mother, it was understandable that he worried. And he worried for good reason. Luca has decided he would like the house to be empty this summer, so he and I can spend some quality time together. I can send whatever you need over to you, or you can pick it up in the first week. I'm sure you can find somewhere to stay. You understand how important it is that I have Luca on our side, don't you, Blaze? He has promised to end the horrible rumors against our family. As a Zabini, you have a duty to help this family. Let me know if I need to get the house elf to send your things over to Britain." He knew he didn't matter much in her eyes, and yet he still felt that dull, distant pang of hurt. She had been a mother before she had been a monster, and Blaze still had trouble trying to remember which one she was to him. A real mother wouldn't throw their son out of his own ancestral home. He had spent enough time with Narcissa to know that. "Blaze!" Eliza's voice came from behind him as he continued to stare at the letter in his lap. "Is everything okay?" Not really, but he would sort something out. His trust fund had enough to buy 4 small manors alone. he could find somewhere for the summer before he came back to Hogwarts. Blaise. Blaise let out a heavy sigh and leant into Eliza's side when she came to sit by him on the sofa. Plonking his head down on her shoulder, he passed the letter over to her and didn't even flinch when she set it on fire after reading through it. Vanishing the ashes carelessly, Blaise once again made himself comfy on her shoulder and smiled slightly at her blatant anger. "Where are you going to go?" she asked, and Blaise didn't blink at her harsh tone. Eliza showed her love through violence and death threats. They all knew it. "I figured I'd just rent out a place. You're staying with me," she said instantly, tense beneath his head, and Blaise laughed softly. "Aren't you going to be too busy with your Dark Lord and the Order and a war and learning how to ride that ridiculous motorbike? I'll never be too busy for you, hard, unyielding, relentless." That was Eliza all over. And to think they had only become friends because Blaise hadn't been able to stop laughing about how much she terrorized Draco. "All right," Blaise agreed easily, knowing when to accept defeat. "I'm not murdering anyone with you, though." Eliza let out a small laugh. "You can just cook us breakfast instead." "Breakfast and murder," Blaise repeated with a smile. "Just your standard summer holiday." Merlin, how lucky they all were to have Eliza in their lives. Fred and George had first met Eliza Potter on the train to Hogwarts, and Fred distinctly remembered catching her in the Gryffindor common room one time with a large box full of spiders. But other than that, they had never really interacted with her. Sure, they knew of her. Michael Rahn had had a few run-ins with her over the years, and Fred knew a lot through the Hogwarts rumor mill, but he wouldn't say he knew H.R. That changed with Blaise Zabini. Fred had first bumped into Blaise Zabini at the start of fourth year. Fred had been sneaking back into the common room, and he had accidentally stumbled upon Zabini sneaking out of it. They had both shared a quiet "oh shit" moment before Fred opened his mouth, never one to pass up an opportunity to tease someone. "Oh, and what do we have here? What are you doing sneaking out of our common room, little snake? What are you doing sneaking into it?" Zabini had responded, to which Fred had nothing else to say too, but fair play. Both he and George had bumped into Zabini multiple times after that, until Fred finally took pity on him and told the Slytherin about the shortcut that would get him back to his common room in 5 minutes instead of 20. "Oh, I already know about that," Zabini said easily, tying the laces on his shoes that he hadn't even been wearing when he stumbled down into the common room. "You two didn't think you were the only ones who caused mischief, did you? Eliza knows this castle like the back of her hand, and she tells you those things out of the kindness of her heart then?" Fred asked, and he and George exchanged glances when Zabini snorted. "No, but I complain a lot, and I'm persistent," he responded glibly, leaping to his feet. He looked at one of the cushions on the sofa for a moment before picking up one of the plush gold ones and looked back at them. "You don't mind if I steal one of these, do you? Only there's a bit of a bet going on. Feel free," George said bemusedly, and they both watched as the Slytherin distractedly shrank the cushion, tucking it into his pocket, and wandered out of the common room. They didn't see Zabini after that for a few weeks, and then it was Zabini who stumbled upon them instead of vice versa. They had been holed up in one of the abandoned classrooms, planning on blackmailing Bagman, when Zabini stumbled in with an impressive string of curses. "What girl have you pissed of this time?" George asked, and Fred burst into laughter when Zabini practically jumped out of his skin. "Not a girl. Let's just say I was not aware Anthony Goldstein was already dating someone. He wasn't pleased when he found that said someone in a broom cupboard with me. One day, Zabini, it will all catch up with you," Fred commented with a shake of his head. He honestly didn't know why everyone was so biased against Slytherins. Sure, most of them were bastards, but by Merlin, they were entertaining. "That day is not today," Zabini responded, poking his head down the corridor. "What are you two up to anyway?" "Blackmail," they said in unison, and without missing beat, Zabini responded with, "Well, you're doing it wrong. No one reads unknown letters, and what would you suggest?" Fred asked curiously. "Oh, wise Zabini," George tacked on, and the two shared a grin. "Threaten them in person," they said together, and Zabini smirked slightly. "If you're an amateur. What you really need to do is blackmail someone in person, and then have them do all the dirty work for you." Fred exchanged a glance with George, and they both turned to face Zabini, who was eyeing them warily. "So if we blackmailed you, you would find someone who would help us set up our business." Fred finished for George, and he felt his smile widen when Zabini let out a small scoff. Please, you have no blackmail on me. Oh, so Thomas Gaunt isn't actually one Tom Riddle, and he and Eliza don't spend an awful lot of time in Moody's office, who isn't actually Moody, but rather a certain Barty Crouch Jr. Now Fred knew he and George weren't actually planning on doing anything with that information. Both the mysterious Tom Riddle and Barty Crouch hadn't done anything to them, which meant they weren't really inclined to do anything back. Merlin Crouch was one of the best defense teachers they'd ever had, and once he had even helped Fred and George hide from a fuming McGonagall. He and George were the disappointments of the family, and they were painfully aware of the fact. The second they could move out, they were going to take it, which meant when you thought there was an illegal militia group hiding in the school, you stayed out of it. But Zabini didn't need to know that. What do you need? Eliza's meant to be an arithmancy whiz, right? George questioned, and Fred handed him their multiple stacks of equations. If you can get her to help with these equations, we'll forget all about the mysterious Tom Riddle. Zabini took the papers with a look of misery. It was the start of a wonderful partnership that led to moments like this. If I get the Niffler, Eliza said, grinning almost maniacally, will you two be able to get it into Umbridge's office? They never let Eliza know about the admittedly morally dubious beginnings to their friendship, but Fred had a sneaking suspicion she knew anyway. Blackmail, it really had a way of bringing people together. Theo woke up that day and decided he wasn't even bothering with the day, crawled back under his duvet, and promptly went back to sleep. He woke again sometime later. The dorm was empty, and after casting a quick tempest, he found he had even managed to sleep through lunch. Not that he was feeling hungry anyway, not that he was feeling anything. Dull, numb apathy seemed to reach down to his very bones. He couldn't be bothered moving, he couldn't be bothered going to classes and pretending that everything was fine. He just wanted to wallow in his melancholy blanket cave and dwell on the never-ending, ceaseless litany of what-ifs. What if he had been smarter? What if he had been quicker? What if? What if? What if? What if his mother was still alive? What would she think? Would she be proud of him, happy about what he has achieved, the choices he had made? Or would she wish for a better son? A son who could hear his full name without flinching. A son who could trust his own house elves and didn't panic in a potions classroom. A son who chose peace over violence. He'd never know. He was just left to wonder and question and wallow in the fact that any life he could have had with her was taken from him. It got harder every year. He forgot the sound of voice, the smell of her favorite perfume. He could only vaguely recall the once crystal-clear memories of his mother, of bedtime stories and baking in the kitchen. Theo didn't have any tears left to cry, but his eyes burned regardless. His moping was interrupted by a knock on the door. "Theo," came Eliza's sing-song voice. "I hope you're decent, because I'm coming in." He didn't even have any time to react before his curtains were being flung open, and Eliza hopped on top of his bed, sitting cross-legged across from him. "Nice pajamas," she said with a smirk, gesturing to his pants, which were covered in tiny cartoon dragons. Theo couldn't even find it in himself to be embarrassed, and instead just shrugged easily in response. He had always liked dragons when he was a kid. "Why are you here, Eliza?" he asked tiredly. She should be in runes right now, or maybe magical theory. Her timetable gave him a headache, and he was too tired and sad to put more thought into it. "As your best friend, I'm legally obligated to never leave you alone when you're moping." "You've never been legally anything in your life," Theo responded, because even at his worst Eliza could never fail in cheering him up. "Okay then," she said easily. "I'm illegally obligated to never leave you alone when you're moping." Theo snorted slightly before they lapsed into silence. "It's the anniversary today, isn't it?" Theo nodded. It was slightly easier knowing that his father was dead, knowing that the bastard had finally gotten what he deserved. But his father being dead didn't bring his mother back, and all he was left with was fading memories and wrinkled photographs. "Well, move over then," Eliza said, and elbowed Theo to the side. She crawled up the bed to sit next to him. She frowned when she realized there wouldn't be enough room on Theo's single bed for them to both fit comfortably. "What are you doing, Eliza?" "You're sad, so I'm staying with you," she said with a small smile. "I'll even listen to you talk about your favorite goblin rebellion, or whatever you history nerds like to talk about." Theo nudged his shoulder against hers, almost sending her toppling out of the bed. How dare you accuse me of liking goblin rebellions? Well, you'll just have to prove me wrong, won't you, Teddy? Don't call me that, Theo said immediately, and blinked in confusion when Eliza shifted into her fox form. Thea didn't even move when she pounced on him, blinking up at him with wide, vivid green eyes. Even as a fox, she looked smug. Thea sighed and flopped back on the bed, bringing Eliza with him, and he rested a hand on her fur with a smile. He'd get through today, and the next one, and the one after that, and he hoped that his mother would love Eliza just as much as he did. Severus hated Careers Day. Of course it was a bit easier for him. Most people in Slytherin came from wealthy families. They had their eyes set on the family business or politics or masteries. They rarely deviated from their chosen path. He wasn't surprised to hear that both his godson and Theo Knott were going to make a name for themselves in politics, continuing the family legacy. He also wasn't surprised to hear that Blaise was going to live off his inheritance, although the curse-breaking had taken him by surprise, as had Daphne Greengrass when she announced her intentions of being a healer. I just kept thinking about that night at the Quidditch World Cup, and if Eliza hadn't been there, or if both she and Astoria had gotten hurt, I wouldn't have known what to do with myself. If he had already been taken surprise by some of his more reasonable students, he dreaded to think about what Eliza would be coming up with, which was why he was incredibly surprised when he found out she had absolutely nothing. No plans or ideas or career aspirations. Why are you struggling with this, Eliza? Severus asked, finally. Out of all my students, I thought you would have been the one I didn't need to worry about. He should have expected this. He should have recognized the signs for what they were. That fight at the start of the year hadn't began over nothing. He had seen her struggling then, and he had still done nothing, ignored what was in front of him. He had fallen into the exact same trap Eliza was making for herself, because Severus had made wrong choice after wrong choice. He had grown up with a bastard of a man masquerading as a father and a sickly mum who couldn't do anything to help him. He had fallen in with the wrong crowd, and had tried so desperately to escape his father, escape his Muggle upbringing, and so he went to the only place that would take him, the war. He had built his whole life around it, and he had never regretted anything more. Like, I need help from a filthy mudblood like you, so please, Eliza, I'm asking you now to think of a life outside of the war. What do you want? Eliza had never failed to smash every expectation he had ever had. He was sure that this time would be no different. Tom sighed as he cast another Tempest charm. Eliza should be on her way to the ministry now, but Tom had a suspicious feeling that she had chosen to take a quick detour first. Merlin help anyone who dared to mess with one of Eliza's court. Will one of you please tell your Dark Lord to stop pacing? It's doing my head in. Black's voice echoed across the room, and Tom sighed angrily. He was so close to just hitting the man with a silencing charm and calling it a day, but knowing Eliza's godfather, he would merely find another way to be just as disruptive. Well, it's not like your pleasant company either, Sirius, Lucius said, and Tom could only watch on in despair as Black dragged all of his Death Eaters into an argument. He swore his Death Eaters weren't this unruly before. He blamed Eliza. It always traced back to Eliza. Hand over my godfather, or I kill you all, starting with him. Speak of the devil, and they shall appear. Tom felt his lips twitch when Eliza's bright ringing laughter filled the prophecy hall. Even in times like these, she never lost that spark of humor. Darling, please don't duel my Death Eaters, he said, finally slipping into conversation, and had to suppress a frown when Eliza tried to hide a flinch at his glamoured appearance. Truthfully, he would be more than happy to drop the guys here and now. He too was somewhat haunted by his encounter at the graveyard. You know, I'm shit at healing spells, wake up but needs must. Tom would cope with the added dramatics just so he could revel in the look on Dumbledore's face when he revealed himself. Come on, Tom, she pleaded for the authenticity. She had a smug smirk on her face, eyes alight with a victory she hadn't yet earned. They both knew he would agree in the end. He always had trouble saying no to her. They met in the death chamber, 20 minutes later. The second she walked into the room, his eyes snapped over to her. She always had this look about her when she was in fight, alive and crackling with energy. He remembered first facing her in the chamber, 12 and small, and somehow larger than life itself. His equal, he would never expect her to bow to anything, not even death, not even him. The duel began quickly, a complex, dangerous dance between the pair of them. The magic seemed to crackle around them as they exchanged curse after curse. Dodging and deflecting, Tom smirked when he saw his knockback Jinx slip through her shields. He tilted slightly to avoid a bombarder, only to curse when she hit him with a gouging curse, pain shooting along his shoulder as blood soaked his battle robes. The duel continued, harsher than before, and Tom felt his heart pounding wildly in his chest as they picked up the pace. And then, a burst of roaring golden flames. Dumbledore had arrived. Tom had barely noticed the order arriving, too caught up in dueling Eliza, but he noticed Dumbledore. The old man instantly made his way towards Eliza, anything to protect his precious chess piece from the big bad monster. "You shouldn't have come here tonight, Tom," he said calmly, and Tom bristled at the use of his name. As if he were something to be pitied, as if he hadn't been dealt the worst hand in life, and overcome everything he'd had thrown at him. Tom adamantly didn't think about what he could have become. The thing he had battled in the cemetery was a mockery of everything he had ever wanted to achieve. Tom sent a killing curse towards Dumbledore, the embodiment of everything he despised. They leapt into the duel, and Tom only felt his anger grow when he saw he was still on an even footing with the old coot, that no matter how much knowledge he acquired or how many years he studied, Dumbledore would still match him. But Dumbledore had never counted on him changing, never counted that his little savior would abandon him and join Tom instead. "Love will only ever be a weakness, little star," Tom said harshly and dropped his glamour. It was easy to act out the scene. Tom had always had to fake these sorts of things, making sure his smile reached his eyes, perfectly timed laughter and heartfelt compliments. He was a master of manipulation, and he knew Eliza could match him easily. So why did he feel so wrong-footed as he continued to speak? "But now I can see you're nothing more than silly schoolgirl with a pathetic crush." Tom wiped her tears away with the pad of his thumb and desperately tried to remind himself that the betrayal and hatred in those glassy green eyes was faked. "So why reveal yourself now? If I were so easy to fool," she choked out angrily, and Tom tried not to freeze under her accusatory tone. "I've grown tired of you," he said liltingly, forgetting the words they had previously agreed on under the weight of her venomous gaze. "And the schoolboy act. I thought perhaps you might be privy to some information, but I see now you're useless to me. And I have no need for useless things." Tom ended with a simper and turned to face Dumbledore, who seemed to be buying their little act just as they had intended. Tom pushed aside the odd bitter feeling in his mouth and focused on the plan. He leapt straight back into the duel, channeling all his anger towards Dumbledore. He might not be able to kill the man today, but if he was quick enough, he could at least deal a bit of damage. Merlin what he would give just to see Dumbledore bleed. "Turning tail and running Potter. Never took you for a coward," Tom called when he heard Eliza shout over to Dumbledore. He wondered why she sounded so adamant before he took notice of the veil in the center of the room that had admittedly even made his own skin crawl. He watched as it shifted slowly towards Eliza. Necromancer. Death Chamber. By Salazar, he was an idiot. His attention was once again diverted when he heard Eliza scoff angrily. "No more than you are," Eliza spat viciously. "I hope you had fun playing schoolboy. It's the closest to love you'll ever get in your pitiful life. Closest to love you'll ever get in your pitiful life. Closest to love you'll ever get. Closest to love you'll." Tom apparated away from the chamber, feeling more rattled than he ever had before. Dumbledore sighed heavily as Eliza left his office. He had feared, oh how he had feared his suspicions about the mysterious Thomas Gaunt. He had hoped to be wrong, hoped that Eliza Potter wouldn't have to suffer any more hardship in her life. But no one could argue with the hand fate dealt them. The fact that Tom was capable of such a ruse was worrying. Something had obviously changed, a shift in his declining sanity that changed his plans. Voldemort, the guise Tom had created himself, had been a challenge but somewhat easy to predict. Tom Riddle was a much harder opponent, especially one that had almost swayed Eliza Potter to his side, especially one that had learned the mechanics of love. Albus knew all too well what happened when love and Dark Lords mixed. He himself had struggled to face Gellert, and he hadn't even killed his once love. He feared for Eliza. He didn't want to put her through a war, didn't want to force her to kill the man who she had so obviously adored. But this was a war, and hard decisions had to be made. Eliza was firmly on their side now, and Albus knew just how far a Slytherin would go when filled with the need for retribution. And no matter what had shifted with Tom, he knew that he would always carry that fear of death with him. He would have to track down the next Horcrux over the summer break. Tom wouldn't be foolish to try anything in the Wisengamot, especially considering he now knew Dumbledore was watching him. But even having the public identity of Thomas Gaunt protected him. Albus wasn't a fool. He could see how his word continued to mean less and less, and even if he screamed it to the world, they wouldn't believe Voldemort was back until it was too late. But Albus refused to lose any more good people to Tom's ridiculous cause. At the end of the day, Albus learned from his mistakes. Tom was still that arrogant boy who thought he could purge Muggleborns from the school. People like Tom, they would never change. They would always be dangerous to themselves and to the world around them. He could only hope that, when the time came, Eliza would make the right decision. The greater good always demanded a sacrifice, and who was Albus to argue with fate? Closest to love you'll ever get. Tom sighed and downed another shot of whiskey. Nagini was a heavy weight over his shoulders as he stared down at the blank journal that was connected to Eliza's. Tom had long since accepted he was incapable of love. It had never truly bothered him that much. But to hear it from Eliza felt different. Eliza, who had always been unwavering in her belief in him. Eliza, who was his pair, his equal. They were two sides of the same coin, and it hurt more than he would like to admit hearing those words coming from her in particular, especially when he couldn't shake the feeling of her lips against his own. And on top of all of that, he had no doubt that he had yet again hurt her because, try as he might, it seemed Tom was only made for violence. But he would make it up to her. In his mind, Eliza Potter deserved the world. It was a strange thing, allowing someone to have this much power over him. Oh, and Eliza, I don't think I could ever tire of you, but as long as it was her, Tom really didn't mind. Tom. She wrote back sometime later, and Tom picked up the journal curiously. I stand by what I said, you know. I don't think you can't love. He shut the journal with a grin and let out a small laugh that made Nagini hiss grumpily over being disturbed. Tom was immortal, and yet somehow he knew Eliza Potter would be the death of him.